Virtually every map published from Joseph Smith's time until today has contained a very serious flaw. And that is that these correlations show the associated Nephite cities of Ammonihah, Noah, and Sidon, cities and lands of Noah and Sidon, west of the river Sidon.
Here's one such example. You notice in red highlight, that's where they place these various cities that we're talking about. There's another example, again in red highlight. That's where they place the cities, west of the river. Here's another example, and again, the river and then west are these three cities that we've mentioned. This is the famous one from John Sorensen. There's the river and these particular associated lands west. Okay, this is an interesting one from Keister down in South America, but again, he has these cities west of the river. This is the famous one that's been all over the church educational system. Dan Ludlow was mainly responsible for the content on here, and again, he's following this same pattern. This one happens to come from Joe Allen, same idea. Here's another one, same idea, even though we got a different river, but nonetheless west of the river. And finally, here's another one that comes in. Virtually every correlation published up to this point shows these particular cities west of the river. Why? Well, the reason is because of a misinterpretation of, or rather a simplistic interpretation of two verses in the book of Alma. One map gets it right. And that is Garth Norman's 2006 map. Here's a copy of it. They're for sale out in the lobby. I've been maintaining since this was published in 2006, this is the most important map yet published on the Book of Mormon. And I'll show you one of the reasons why here as we go through the rest of this presentation. Alma 8:3 says the land of Melech was west of River Sidon. Okay? Point number one. Continuing on, Alma 8:5 says that the city of Ammonihah was 3 days' journey north of Melech. On balance, if we have one entity west of the river and another entity north of the river, you would assume they're both west of the river, okay? And that's the assumption people have made. Let me walk you through a hypothetical example. Here we have a section of the Mississippi River, and that little white spot there is a hypothetical land of Melech. We go a 3 days journey, which by anyone's measure is going to be somewhere on the order of 45 to 60 kilometers. And there we locate a hypothetical city of Ammonihah, both west of that river. This particular section of Mississippi happens to go between Hannibal, Missouri, and a little town called Argyle up in Iowa. However, if we were to take this exact same syllogism that Book of Mormon students have been using now for over 100 years, and apply it to this particular stretch of the river, it would go like this. Because you go 15 kilometers east of Argyle, Iowa, and you'll find the interesting town of Nauvoo, Illinois. I could hypothesize Nauvoo, Illinois is east of the Mississippi River. There are many towns in Iowa north, 3 days journey north of Nauvoo, Illinois. Therefore, Iowa is east of the Mississippi River. But as you can see, that's complete nonsense, because rivers don't follow straight lines, and because Nauvoo, Illinois is right on the river. The river trending in a southwesterly direction at this point in time allows us to have an entity north of it and yet still be on the other side of the river. Okay, continuing on. Therefore, if we have in Book of Mormon geography a river which is trending to the northwest, and if Melech is close to the river, and by the way, if you read the Book of Mormon with consistency, Melech was right on the river. People who try to put Melech 50 kilometers or 100 kilometers west of the river are simply not following the text. If you go through, there are 8 instances in the text where something is either east or west of Sidon. In all cases, it was right on the river. The context makes that clear. Melech, therefore, nope, back to that one. Okay. Melech being right on the river, if the river is trending in northwesterly direction, we could have Ammonihah 3 days journey north of Melech and still be on the other side of the river. There are 2 rivers that have been under consideration in the general Mesoamerican area as having been the River Sidon. The Gruthalva is outlined in blue, the Usumacinta in red. They both trend northwesterly over much of their course. Okay, continuing on. As we read the Book of Mormon with care, what we find is that the Nephites are settling different areas in different times. In fact, just a few weeks ago, Bill Hamlin published a piece where he said one of the things he really wants about Book of Mormon studies is to have a chronology and a geography that correlate, where we are seeing the expansion of the Nephite nation both temporally and spatially, but in a coordinated fashion. Well, I completely concur. And in fact, if you go to my blog, which is called bookofmormonresources.blogspot.com, and read the article called Expansion of the Nephite Nation, you will see the first attempt at producing that very set of data. Temporal expansion across as space and time are coordinated. What we see in the Book of Mormon is that the central Sidon corridor was populated first. The northern part, up with Zarahemla and Minon and Gideon being part of the very first wave, Ammonihah also part of that first wave. How do we know that? We know that because as we analyze the missionary journeys of Alma, he is going to the very same place that his own father, Alma I, founded the church in a generation previously. And the places where Alma I founded his church approximately 120 BC were, according to the text, Zarahemla, Gideon, Mulek, or Melech, I'm sorry, and also Ammonihah. So those four were likely in that central Sidon corridor where that original Mosiah Zarahemla complex was located. By 90 BC, which is when we pick up Alma 22 and Alma chapter 1 and 2, we now have Manti entering the picture at the very extreme southern edge of the Nephite lands. Every single thing, and this is the important point, every single thing mentioned in the Book of Mormon prior to 72 BC is either in the central Sidon corridor or east of the river. What happens in 72 BC? We have the founding of Moroni. Where's Moroni? Right on the east coast. So between 120 BC and 72 BC, we have the Nephites expanding like crazy to the east, eventually reaching the east coast. Once they achieve that objective, they have basically gotten their territorial imperative. They have achieved their continental design. Their vision to the east was completed. We then have a pivotal scripture. It's Alma 50:11. And that's when they turn the switch and begin to focus their attention on the west. Now, prior to 72 BC, there is one outpost the Nephites maintain that's on the West Sea. But it's not in the land of Zarahemla. It's actually in the land of Bountiful, okay? Right on the seacoast. And that's a special choke point where they can station a military garrison and they can prevent people from going up that west coast. So this is the central Sidon corridor. Go ahead and go to the next slide. This is an internal reconstruction of the Nephite nation after at approximately 67 BC. By this point in time, we do have some entities into the west. But after the breakthrough at Alma 50:11, 72 BC, where we have the Nephites for the first time moving west of that central Sidon corridor. Go ahead and next slide. This is my interpretation of how that fits on the modern day map. And continue on. A very important point. How we come to this particular conclusion, that the settlement pattern in the Nephite nation was up the Sidon corridor, then to the east, all the way to the seacoast, and only then, after they had reached the east seacoast, then we begin to populate to the west, okay? Here's where it comes from. Number one, the 7 churches that Alma I founded. And we can tell from the text that 4 of those churches were Zarahemla, Gideon, Melech, and Ammonihah. Okay, next. Nehor founded one church. There is one place in the Book of Mormon associated with Nehor. It's Ammonihah. No question, if you read the text, Nehor's church was in Ammonihah. We read in the first chapter of Alma, where was Nehor going when he encountered Gideon? He was going to preach to his followers. Where were they located? They were located in Ammonihah. Nehor was headed towards Ammonihah when he encountered and slew Gideon in the land of Gideon. Where was Gideon? East of the river. Okay? Consequently, Nehor was traveling through Gideon to Ammonihah to preach to his followers when he met and slew the aged Gideon. Therefore, Gideon being east of the river, Ammonihah being beyond Gideon. Okay, next. Nehor had a successor who was even more nefarious, Amaleki. By the way, highly recommend Royal Skousen's critical text right here, because in this we learn that the Amalekites are actually the Amalekites. This guy Amaleki is all over the map. In fact, I've got an article on my blog called Peripatetic Amaleki to explain how all this fits together. Nehor's successor Amaleki takes over for him where? In Ammonihah. He raises an army, he secedes from the Nephite republic, and he then comes at the people. Where does he come from? From the east. Where did he engage the Nephites? Hilamnihu, east of Sidon. Okay, continue. By 90 BC, the Nephites had populated the central Sidon corridor, and they had begun to move towards the east. We see that now in 22, very clear. Okay, continue. By 90 BC, we've got well, there's the reference for the fact that they're pushing the Lamanites towards that east coast. Okay, continue. We then are told by Mormon the precise point in time, because we have a parallel passage to Alma 22 and Alma 50. But Alma 50 is quite a bit different, because we're now 18 years further down the chronology. In Alma 50:11, that's the point at which Mormon says, we now began to clear out the west. So I basically indicate to you, from now on, use chronology in addition to geography to show temporal space and time simultaneously, and the Book of Mormon becomes much, much clearer. And I personally am thrilled that Google Earth is now part of the mix, because with it we can measure with precision. The Book of Mormon says up, we calculate vertical rise. If the Book of Mormon says down, we calculate the vertical drop. If it says over, we look for something they're having to cross over to get there. And it's all, in fact, there's a model you can download right now. It's been downloaded almost 1,000 times as of right now. Go to my blog. It's called bookofmormonresources.blogspot.com, and look for the article called Book of Mormon Model, and download the entire model here on Google Earth. Have all the fun you can stand. Okay, next PowerPoint presentation, I'm going to bring up John W. Welch, Jack Welch. We're going to talk a little bit about the development of Book of Mormon studies in the 20th century. Okay. All right, so it starts obviously with Joseph Smith, and John Lund did a nice job today of telling us about Joseph's visions, Lucy Mack Smith, some of Oliver Cowdery's comments. This represents this Schoolcraft guy who wrote an awful lot about the Indians in the time period of the Book of Mormon. And so I use him as being characteristic or stereotypical of the sorts of things being talked about in the Western American frontier in at the time the Book of Mormon was coming forth. We then have, of course, the stuff that John Lund shared with us about Stevens, and I completely echo what I heard this morning. This came as a complete surprise. The lines were around the block in New York City to see the exhibition. And when this hit in Nauvoo in 1841, the fall of 1841, Joseph Smith was blown away. And he was, in fact, seeing some of the things he had seen a decade earlier in some of the visions. And who were his cohorts at that time? Well, it was John Taylor, there's a picture in his early days, and Wilford Woodruff. So even if everything that was written during that time period, coming from Stevens, was not from the prophet, they were from a couple of pretty reliable sources. All right, we don't have a whole lot happening after the Saints come west. Brigham had other issues on his mind, and the Book of Mormon sort of fell into a bit of a doldrum there. But we did have the most influential intellectual in the Brigham Young era, and that was Orson Pratt. What happens in 1879 with Orson Pratt?
Well, we get the new 1879 edition of the Book of Mormon.
And that has footnotes all the way through it.
Yeah, including a footnote that says Lehi landed in Chile.
The whole business about 33 degrees south latitude at this point in time was beginning to be canonized. Furthermore, we've got the entire hemispheric model because Orson Pratt's footnotes are very clear that this thing went all the way to core up in New York.
And people also need to realize that it was Orson Pratt who put in the chapters and verses the way we have them. The earlier editions had the original chapters from the first edition, but no verse numbers. And the chapters, which are still followed in the RLDS editions and the Community of Christ, if they're still publishing that, are they?
They absolutely are, Jack. In fact, we have a table back here with some friends from Independence as we speak,
Good,
right there with Bob
good.
Smith.
I know
Yes.
Bob's here. But having the chapters and verses broken up sometimes is misleading because you don't realize what texts go together. Your point about reading the chronology in the whole text is important, because if you think that a text ends at the end of a chapter, you've got to ask, well, did it really end at the end of that chapter, or is that Orson Pratt?
Mm-hmm. But he was a powerful figure, and based on that, very few people tried to oppose Orson Pratt in his day as far as what was heterodox or what was orthodox. One of them who did was this interesting fellow, George Ottinger. He published in 1879, he published a little piece in the Juvenile Instructor where he speculated, he thought the Usumacinta River was in fact the River Sidon, but he was in the very tiny minority. But that's the first reference I know of to that particular instance. We then have an interesting guy, George Reynolds, who did the concordance of the Book of Mormon, this vast work.
While he was in jail.
He was one of the test cases for polygamy, and he made good use of his time in jail.
And you've heard of Reynolds versus the United States, the United States Supreme Court opinion dealing with whether the anti-polygamy laws were constitutional or not. It's George Reynolds who was the named plaintiff in that.
But in any event, in his concordance, he is parroting Orson Pratt. Sidon River, Magdalena, in Columbia. What were they looking for Zarahemla? Western side of this large north-flowing river.
But he had a lot of time and couldn't go on any field trips. So what would you do?
So the next thing that would happen is would send BYU down there, because those guys have the budgets and the young bucks and so forth. So we have Benjamin Clough now in 1900, right at the turn of the century. And they are so convinced in Salt Lake and in Provo that the Magdalena River was the River Sidon that we're going to get on horseback and go south. Now I have an interesting down in Columbia, and they're going to look for Zarahemla on the western slope of this north-facing river. My great uncle Heber Magleby was the #2 man in that caravan up there. And he went all the way on the trip with him, and then he and Benjamin Clough, after they came back, Benjamin ended up being kicked out, fired as the president of BYU.
Well, if you want the whole story on Benjamin Clough and BYU, there's an article in BYU Studies on that, and he does end up his life in, what would you say, just kind of quiet repose, selling vegetables
in California
down by
But he had a
San
very
Pedro.
interesting time before the Mexican Revolution, where he was in the rubber business in Tabasco.
He sure did.
And it was Heber Magleby and Benjamin Clough down there running this rubber plantation.
And how many of you have been to the Monty Bean Life Science Museum at BYU? Why do we have that? One of the reasons is because we've got all these artifacts, all these samples and specimens that they brought back from that expedition, insects and all kinds of things, and they're all cataloged there. So his legacy lasts in other ways.
So we were trying our best to go down there and find Zarahemla in 1900. All right, we then have a guy coming along, Joel Ricks, and he went down to South America several times. In fact, made 4 trips from Logan down there. And he went and found mountain valleys in the Andes, and he was absolutely convinced he could map out the entire Book of Mormon right there in the Colombian Andes.
Now, these people are in the early 20th century, and we probably ought to mention Kirk doesn't have a picture of B.H. Roberts to drop into the discussion here. But his New Witnesses for God in America, 3-volume work published in 1909 and 1911, very important in Book of Mormon studies. And then in 1920, you remember it's B.H. Roberts who gets the letter from Mr. Couch, forwarded to him by a member of the church, who Couch had asked these 5 questions. Where are the horses? And why do we have so many different language families in the Western Hemisphere? And B.H. Roberts did not have answers for those questions. But today, and I notice we have horses coming out of this corral into the audience today, later this afternoon, we do have better answers for all of those. And let me just say one last thing on B.H. Roberts. Because I've spent a lot of time trying to get all of B.H. Roberts' statements about the Book of Mormon together. and now have them in one electronic database. And, people worry about, well, did B.H. Roberts fall off the wagon somehow? Were these problems that he couldn't answer so troubling to him that he somehow suffered with an impaired testimony? I don't believe that for a minute. And I think the strongest evidence for that is that after all of the couch and other studies of the Book of Mormon that B.H. Roberts was involved in, he wrote what he thought was going to be his magnum opus called The Truth, the Way, the Life, which some of you can now read. BYU Studies published that back in 1994. But that was written in 1927 and 28, at the end of his time as being mission president in New York. And if he had any problems with the Book of Mormon in 1921, 22, he would not have said what he says about the Book of Mormon in The Truth, the Way, the Life. And so that's a more complicated argument that goes along with that. But B.H. Roberts, he and I think the First Presidency, wasn't it in 1928 that the First Presidency finally said regarding all of this Mesoamerican geography in the Book of Mormon, we are not going to take a position on the church as an official statement. President Lund in the First Presidency says...
That was based on a committee that James J. Talmage chaired in 21.
That's right. And they finally said, we are going to leave it to the archaeologists, the scientists. Let's find out more about what really happened. We're not going to go out on a limb before we know what we need to know.
And that was because you had guys like Joel Ricks, who was still advocating the Orson Pratt hemispheric model. And then you had some interesting people. This is Paul Henning, the very first LDS archaeologist. He was baptized about the turn of the century. He was a German, had migrated to Mexico, baptized in Mexico when the church was just barely getting started down there. I don't have a photograph of him, but I do own in my personal collection one of his pamphlets, and you're seeing a copy of that pamphlet. That happened to be published in Spanish by the National Museum of Mexico City in 1917. He obviously advocated for a Mesoamerican setting for the Book of Mormon. Then we have a most interesting fellow that came to us from the Reorganite tradition, Louis Edwards Hills. He wrote a wonderfully important piece in the early 1920s where he, for the first time, identified the potential site of Yaxchilan, western side of a major north flowing river, and there's been a lot of enthusiasm for that particular correlation in and around the Independence, Missouri area ever since. This guy happened to be the bugle boy for General George A. Custer in his younger years. Oh, really? He was a rough and ready guy, but pretty influential.
Roosevelt, huh?
So next we have James E. Talmage, who was responsible for the 1920 edition of the Book of Mormon, and that's where we get very high-class, highbrow English. And we finally basically done away with a lot of some of those archaisms and some of those colloquialisms in the text.
Yeah, thereby eliminating some of the important Hebraisms in the Book of Mormon that Royal Skousen has pointed out others. Before then, when you wanted to express a conditional, you would say, if such and such is the case, and this is the case. In Hebrew, you can do that, but that doesn't make sense in English. You say, if this, then this is the case. And so we now have if, then in Helaman chapter 12, for example, thanks to James Talmage. Now, also on Talmage, something else happens that I wanted to just... Kirk and I have not rehearsed this, by the way, so I'm not sure whether I'm jumping ahead here or not. But one of the things that Talmage wanted to emphasize was that Mormons were Christians, and therefore, what books does he write that are still in circulation today? Jesus the Christ, the Victorian Life of Christ, and the Articles of Faith. And what's the Articles of Faith all about? It's proving scripture after scripture that all 13 of the Articles of Faith can be found and documented in the Bible. So with Talmage, we have a big shift that really goes away from using the Book of Mormon. It had been used, I think, a little more, but starting in the 30s and 40s, the Book of Mormon is de-emphasized, perhaps for ecumenical kinds of purposes. We'll come back to that point in a minute.
Yeah, very, very good point. But Talmage was vastly influential in the text, and he also convened a meeting in 1921 where he had Joel Ricks come in and present his he had thousands of maps in circulation around the church at that point in time, Joel did. And this man, the 30th son of Brigham Young, Generally considered the most intelligent of Brigham's posterity, had a degree from West Point, was an engineer, and he had done engineering not only in the northeastern part of the United States, but also in Mexico. And he came into this meeting in 1921, and he advocated that no, he wanted to take us back to the original Joseph Smith, Stevens and Catherwood type of vision. He said it had to be in Mexico and Guatemala. And that was one of the reasons why the 1928 First Presidency said what it said. It's a draw. We don't know. Yeah. We'll let the scholars sort all this out. All right, 1938. We have M. Wells Jakeman, who's a student at Berkeley, and he forms the Itzan Society. He was a historian more than an archaeologist, and he was enamored, as Elder Brewerton, who's in the audience today, can testify. The Chronicles, the Spanish Indian Chronicles, are an endless source of intrigue and interest. And Jakeman spent the vast majority of his life immersed in those. He was convinced that the Itza were, in fact, the Nephites. And consequently, he formed at Berkeley the Itzan Society, and that then became the Department of Anthropology, the Department of Archaeology at BYU. And this man, John A. Widsoe, I love this guy because my great-great-grandpa baptized him in Norway. So we take credit for John A. Widsoe. But he was, among the members of the 12, he was a tremendous advocate for more of an academic or scientific approach to the scriptures. He had been the president of Utah State Agricultural College back in those days.
Where my grandfather was a professor, so.
Anyway, it was
we can play this professor ancestor game too, you know.
It was Elder Widsoe who was instrumental in informing what was then the Department of Archaeology at BYU in '46. Right off the bat, we have a major acquisition. The William E. Gates collection comes to BYU.
Go ahead.
This was a collection primarily of manuscripts. Lots of codices, lots of things like we had on here display here today. Some of the earliest transcriptions of Mayan, material that eventually became fairly important in deciphering the Mayan language were in the Gates collection.
I didn't know if you were going to leave Utah State that quickly. Are you going to come back to Milton R. Hunter?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
But I have a connection to Milton R. Hunter. Do you have a connection to Milton R. Hunter?
I'll think of one.
All right.
Actually, I do. He taught Institute up at Utah State, and my father was in one of his classes. My father's never recovered from that.
It was in 1947 that under Jakeman's tutelage, the very first symposium on the archaeology of the scriptures began to be held, and that was held for 40 years in Provo. The last one was in 1987. So what we're doing today is a successor to that same kind of an enterprise. We also had an organization put together called the University Archaeological Society in 1949, and it lasted till '67. It then morphed into the Society for Early Historic Archaeology, SEHA, and that lasted until 1988. So we had the beginnings of newsletters and proceedings and so forth. And Ross Christensen and Welch Jakeman were the two lights behind that. What you see in the photograph up there is are two bound volumes that have all of the UAS newsletters and the SEHA newsletters combined, approximately 200 issues. A lot of interesting stuff in there, especially if you're interested in historical stuff. Now, Welch Jakeman had a very favorite site. It was called Agua Catal, which is near Ciudad Carmen on the Laguna de Terminos in western Campeche. He thought that was bountiful. We then have the beginnings of modern Book of Mormon research with Hugh Nibley, who comes to BYU campus. And it didn't take him very long after he got up here to publish what became the very first of the most important series of books on the Book of Mormon, Lehi in the Desert and the World of the Jaredites, 52.
Nibley came to BYU in 1947 after serving in the military intelligence in World War II. And he'd worked on all that Lehi in the Desert and the Arab stuff while he had been in the military. And then he picked up a lot of Arabic books while he was over in London. He could buy them cheap in bombed-out bookstores. And then he came back and worked in the Church Historical Department, and that's where he was encouraged to go to BYU and to join the faculty. A lot of interesting stories about how he got there, but you can read all about that in the biography, A Consecrated Life.
Just so you know, Jack Welch was the general editor for the collected works of Hugh Nibley's series. He spoke at his funeral. This man is about as well connected to the Nibley legacy as anyone currently living.
But let me say something about Nibley before we go on, because, you know, Wells Jakeman and Hugh Nibley and Sidney Sperry, I assume you're going to mention Sperry here in a minute. No?
No, I wasn't planning on it.
Well, okay.
I was focused more on the New World connection.
Right, but with Nibley, you see, we start going into textual and historical analysis, and Sperry and his protege, Dan Ludlow, are interested in the Hebrew origins of the Book of Mormon and the biblical connections. But what happened, I came to BYU in 1964 as a freshman. I walked into this battlefield, and I had no idea what was going on. But you had Jakeman, you had Nibley, you had Sperry, and these three great, brilliant people couldn't stand each other. I mean, I think that's a fair statement. They rarely talked to each other, and when they did, it wasn't very pleasant. And why? I don't know, except that they had their tools, and they thought that the way to get to the truth of the Book of Mormon was through one particular lens. And I think while they contributed amazing things by looking at what they did the way they did, it wasn't until the later, in the 70s and so on, that we begin to get enough people who are going out and doing things in all kinds of anthropological, archaeological, textual, historical, linguistic, every discipline in the academy now has been engaged in doing things with the Book of Mormon. And I think this triumvirate, in a way, showed us that all of these different approaches each has value, even though they didn't get together. But I think that's an important part of our historical development here with Book of Mormon studies.
So that's why the Farms logo eventually had was supposed it was trying to encapsulate that in one graphical image of these various disciplines together. Now, a very interesting figure comes on the scene, Thomas Stewart Ferguson. 1952, he organizes in California the New World Archaeological Foundation. And it has in it some of the leading bright lights. Alfred Kidder was involved, and some of the very best people from the Carnegie Institution, and people that went on, like William Sanders, went on to have a tremendous career at Pennsylvania and so forth. He wants to go prove the Book of Mormon.
No, go ahead.
And he's an attorney, and he has a little bit of money. Not a lot, but a little. And he immediately begins to go hit up David O. McKay for lots of money. Well, why? 1952. What had just happened in 1952? We finally had Nibley's Lehigh in the Desert. It was finally clear that there really was something going on here.
And in 1957, how many of you remember the High Priest's Manual in 1957? That little orange paperback?
That's going to be the approach to the Book of Mormon, again, by Hugh Nibley.
So the 50s, we've got things,
we've got things
really
starting
to happen.
Now, 1953, the very first expedition under the auspices of this new NWAF into, actually it was in Tabasco. Where did they go? Huimanguillo, Tabasco, western side of a major north-facing river in the coastal plain. That's where they were looking for Zarahemla in 1953. Pedro Armias, who went on to have a sterling career as a Mexican anthropologist. He actually came from Spain originally, but he spent most of his career in Mexico. He led that particular group. This is where they were. Huimanguillo shows up on there. It's too dark for anybody to be able to see it, but that blue is the Grijalva River as it flowed in Book of Mormon. Very important point. The 1953 expedition found virtually no evidence of pre-classic civilization along the western slope of the lower Grijalva. Virtually none. Why was that? Because the river had changed course. I've spent a great deal of time with hydrologists in Tabasco. We heard earlier today that Tabasco, at certain points in time, is subject to incredible severe inundation, flooding. It's all one big giant river delta. They know their hydrology in Tabasco. There's some very, very bright people down there, hydraulic engineers. They can show you how the Grijalva River has changed course over time. At the time of the Book of Mormon, this is what the Grijalva River looked like. It actually was came into Blasillo, which went right past La Venta, and it's where the Tonalá River is today. That's why they didn't find anything in 1953, because the river had actually shifted over time to get there. Nonetheless, they were, the people back here in Utah were a little ticked off at that, so they sent Tom Ferguson down. And then we have this man on the scene, because John Sorensen, and by the way, John was going to present today, and I'm the one that invited him, and when he finally bailed on us, I took the heat from the organizers here, and I apologize for that. But here's the issue. John Sorensen, now 88 years old. We asked him to come give a presentation, similar to the one he gave at the Fair Conference here a couple of months ago, introducing us and getting us excited about his magnum opus, which appears in early 2013, called Mormon's Codex. It's an 800-page thing. I've already got several of the chapters that I've been able to read through. Marvelous piece of work. John Sorensen, with the recent changes at BYU and the fact that there's now this interpreter organization that's the Bill Hamlin and Dan Peterson group, they're putting pressure on the Maxwell Institute. So the Maxwell Institute suddenly decided to ramp up the editorial process for John's book and get it out as quickly as they possibly could. That meant John had to accelerate his editorial schedule. And at 88 years of age, he has to pick his battles, and he only has so much energy left in the day, and he is in intense final editing right now for Mormon's Codex. Hence the fact that he declined the invitation, or basically told us no, he could not fulfill his commitment to come and speak here today. We apologize to those of you in the audience that came to hear John Sorensen. But Jack Welch is not a bad substitute. Although I keep trying to bring Jack back to the New World side of things a little more. But John was on that trip. He was one of the excavators in 1953. And what did they do when Tom Ferguson came down and they had to report, Tom, we take all your money, and we sat here and dug basically for 25 kilometers up and down the western bank of the Grijalva around Huimangil. We found practically no chicken pottery whatsoever. Don't have much to report in the way of preclassic remains here. So John and Tom Ferguson hop in a Jeep and spend 2 eventful weeks, and they go up to the upper Grijalva, and they go up into the Grijalva Basin, and they go up near the ruins that today we know as Santa Rosa, which is actually underwater today by the big dam that's there. But they hit the mother lode. They see preclassic remains everywhere. There are literally dozens of sites that showed significant occupations in Book of Mormon times. That so colored John Sorensen's view that to this day, that legacy remains with us. And that's why many of the maps today read the way they do. And why many of the correlations today are the way they are. Because this is the effect of the enthusiasm that these two brethren had as they began to encounter Book of Mormon time period remains in that particular part of the world.
Yeah. And I'm jumping ahead quite a ways, but I just want to pay tribute to John, and I'm glad to be here if it helps him to be able to get his book done, because that's going to be something we're all going to want to read. And you know, we'll talk about farms in a couple minutes, I'm sure, but you do need to know that in 1979 a very important event in the history of Book of Mormon scholarship happened, and that's when Kirk Magleby and John Sorensen and I got on the phone together. And John has been a great blessing in my life and in all of our lives. And hey, I remember that bus trip we took, Farms Bus, where Joe Allen took us.
1983, the Farms tour. We have some folks here that are on that tour.
That's right.
There may never be another Book of Mormon tour quite like it. Okay. Here John Sorensen and Jack Welch both speak in the evenings.
Well, and on the bus every minute of the day. That was a fabulous trip. So.
Anyway, love John Sorensen. Okay, what also happened in 1953? Stela 5 hits the LDS consciousness. The very first publication of Jakeman, an unusual tree of life sculpture in southern Mesoamerica. It's hard to overstate the incredible effect Stela 5 had. I was growing up about 7 or 8 years later in Arizona, and there were people all over, Latter-day Saint families all over Arizona who had mock-ups of Stela 5, little carved versions of Stela 5 on their front lawn. This was how you announced the neighbors, I'm a Mormon. Because you had there's one out in the lobby out here that's kind of similar to what I recall. But this was a sensation.
An icon.
It became a cultural icon. So much so
Go ahead.
that, well, here was the NWAF immediately in '55 got beaucoup bucks funding from David O. McKay and has ever since. Millions have been invested by the official church. NWAF, that's my particular collection of some of their monographs.
Let me just say something before we pass over 1954. And by the way, how many of you served in missions where they had a copy of the Book of Mormon that you gave away that had a paper dust jacket on it with the Zappa, with the Stela 5 on it?
There's Das Buch Mormon.
There you go, that's mine. Yep, that's the copy of the Book
We
of Mormon.
literally, on the Book of Mormon itself, published a line drawing of Stela 5.
And that's my copy of the Book of Mormon. I handed out hundreds of those, but that's the one that I discovered chiasmus in, that very copy, which I still have. So, but on 1954, something else happened, because, we've got all of this enthusiasm going on, and, people finding every hole in the ground is a baptismal font, wherever it is in the Western Hemisphere. But at that time, someone, and I'm not sure who it is, Noel Reynolds has written an article about the emergence of the Book of Mormon in church educational curricula and in the church generally. You go back before 1954, there was not a Book of Mormon class taught at BYU. That's surprising to a lot of people. But you can read the whole history about how this came about and how much resistance there was initially when the religion faculty was told, we're going to teach a Book of Mormon class. And soon after, it became a required class, which, how many of you went to BYU at a time when you didn't have a Book of Mormon requirement? There may be still some who can remember that. Okay, we're all over the hill.
There's a lady right back there.
Okay, there we go. There we go. All right. But let me just say, read Noel Reynolds' article on this, because when this was proposed, the immediate reaction was we were going to have one 2-hour class covering the whole Book of Mormon in one semester, one 2-hour class. And the faculty said, it can't be done. There's not enough to say. But that shows you the state of Book of Mormon research in the early 50s. And when I came to BYU as a freshman, believe me, the whole shelf of Book of Mormon books that had been published was just a handful of books. Today, quite a different story.
Yeah, when I first met John Sorensen right after my mission in '74, I said, I think I've read about everything that's been posted on the Book of Mormon. I said, didn't take you very long, did it? Anyway, 1957, we have Hugh Nibley's second book on the Book of Mormon, An Approach to the Book of Mormon. And Joseph Fielding Smith was instrumental in having that become the Melchizedek Priesthood Manual for that particular year. That was pretty interesting. Can you imagine today having...
Well, and David O. McKay was asked. The committee came and brought this to President McKay and said, we're not sure we want to use this. We'd never used anything like this as a priesthood manual. And President McKay said, and of course he was an educator, he said, well, what's the problem? And he said, well, we think it's a little bit over the heads of the brethren in, and then he mentioned a few little towns in southern Utah. And President McKay looked at him and said, well, then let them reach. And it went forward.
Moving forward, what happened in 1967? We have this man in Regensburg, Germany, with that copy of the Book of Mormon you saw just a minute ago, and it jumps off the page at him. If chiasmus is evidence of Hebrew influence in the Gospel of Matthew, it is evidence of Hebrew influence in the Book of Mormon. And the world's never been the same since. And when I went to BYU as a freshman in 1971, there were symposia being offered, chiasmus, the mind of God. The enthusiasm for this particular discovery mirrored and paralleled the enthusiasm for Stela 5 just a decade before.
Yeah, there was a real hunger for information about this. And
this was published in that particular article BYU said is 1969. That's how I was introduced to it right before my mission. And electricity went through me as I read that particular article. Jack has a file of people's reactions to when they very first found out about chiasmus. And if any of you want to write that up and give them to Jack, he'll be appreciative.
yeah, well, let me say something just quickly about that. How many of you can remember where you were, who told you, and what your reaction was the first time you heard about chiasmus or saw an example of it. Even though it was probably a long time ago, right? That's one of those things that we remember. If you would like to send me an email or just get it to Kirk or so on, I think this is an important spiritual and cultural part of our history that a generation from now will be forgotten if we don't record what it was like to learn these kinds of things and what impact it had on you. Please send them in, and I'd love to have that.
1973, we have this man appear on the scene, Garth Norman. That's when his album of sculpture appeared. And by the way, you saw a little bit here a minute ago about that 3D rendering of Stela 5. The Clark Moreno drawings of Stela 5 that came out in the latter part of about 1998 time frame that were intended to discredit Stela 5, radically reinterpret that particular monument. Don't worry about it. You haven't seen the end of that particular thing yet. There's a lot still forthcoming about that particular monument. Okay, Milton R. Hunter. I served my mission in Peru. And I was blessed with companions who allowed me to go every P-Day and then would selectively go proselyte and would go search out university professors that were anthropologists, and we began to become somewhat of antiquarians. I wrote a letter to Milton R. Hunter. He had been called in this era in the 50s of all this enthusiasm for things Book of Mormon. He'd been called by David O. McKay to be the point man among the brethren on the Book of Mormon. And that's why you actually saw a picture of he and his wife in the little blue missionary copy of the Book of Mormon, because they were taking travels around and checking out Pachacamac and outside of Lima. He was basically a tourist with a camera. And whatever looked like it was a white Indian or whatever looked like something that had some sort of remote connection, Milton R. Hunter was going to get excited about that. I wrote him a letter in 1974 as I was about 18 months from my mission and said, here's some of the interesting things we found out here in Peru. And he wrote back and he said this. He said, I am so disappointed at what NWAF has not found in 20 years of digging in Mexico that I may be ready to entertain a new correlation. So it wasn't just Tom Ferguson and it wasn't just Dee Green and some of the others who became disillusioned about the intersection between real dirt archaeology and their fantasized notions of what the Book of Mormon should look like. But even this man had begun to have his doubts, and he was extraordinarily anxious, so anxious that he made it possible for me to stay down several more months and just be a researcher at the end of my mission before I came home from Peru.
Where you found a lot of bearded figurines.
Oh, that's where my interest in beards began. That was my first contribution when we started farms. All right, then I came home from BYU and began to be the research assistant of this man, Paul Chessman, and of all my heavens, what an interesting experience that was. Every wacko, forgery, nonsensical thing you can imagine ended up coming through this man's office before we were finished. I'll tell you about one. There was a mission president in England who had a guy that came to him that had the brass plates. So he got really excited, and he let Salt Lake know, there's some folks here that have found the brass plates. They came from Peru. They had an uncle back in the 1800s who went on an expedition to Peru. He found the brass plates. They're now in England. I've seen them. Well, short story, all of the ecclesiastical leaders in the church were going by, are they asking for money? And the answer was no at that point in time. And consequently, they thought they were genuine. And so we hosted them, and they came up and they met Spencer Kimball, and they came down and met with us in Paul Chessman's office, and I became the custodian of the brass plates. I took them over to Geneva Steel, to my buddy Herschel Pedersen, and had him run through the metallurgical lab, and we came back that they were actually manufactured in England itself in probably within about the last 25 years because of the alloys that were in there. Anyway, this was just one example of an elaborate forgery, and we dealt with all kinds of that kind of nonsensical stuff. This was the era, the atmosphere, when something very important happened. This is Jack's brother-in-law, 1979, an attorney, Southern California. He currently runs the Utah World Trade Center, and what happened in '79?
Well, I was practicing law in Los Angeles as a tax lawyer. After going through BYU, Hugh Nibley had been my Book of Mormon teacher. I went to law school, and I kept up my interests, of course. I I gave firesides all over Southern California. I was surprised at how many people didn't even know about things that Hugh Nibley had published, let alone all of the others. And I had a Xerox machine there at the law office, and I would go out giving a fireside, and people would say, how can I get a copy of that paper about the Liahona by Hugh Nibley? Or other things. I began collecting papers, and if people would give me their address or their business card, I'd just Xerox these and send them out. And I finally thought, this is crazy. I'm not going to spend my life copying things and sending them out to people free. I think we need an organization. And as a tax lawyer one day, I was organizing two tax-exempt organizations. We didn't have computers in those days, but we were state-of-the-art, and we had mag cards on our typewriters. And so after my secretary had run these 2 sets of articles of incorporation and bylaws, I just changed the name on one of them. And here in the carpool going home with Lou Kramer, my brother-in-law, who was practicing law in Los Angeles, and Clark Waddups. Any of you know Judge Waddups here in Federal District Court? Clark was in my firm at the time, and the 3 of us were living in the same ward in Glendale. So on the way home that day, I said, I think I ought to start some kind of an organization. And Clark said, well, what are you going to call it? And I said, well, I don't know. It should be a foundation, and it ought to have something to do with ancient research. F-A-R, far out. Maybe we'll call it the Far Out Organization. And I said, no, it's got to have something to do with Mormon. This is really a Mormon-centered thing. This is not just about gee whiz dirt archaeology. We want this organization to also deal with religion, with theology, with the history of doctrine, with words, with literature. It's our Mormon culture, F-A-R-M, farm. And it's Mormon studies. And out came farms. And I said, well, we'll call it farms. How about that? And Lou and Clark just broke out in laughter. And we said, well, we'll keep looking for another name. And we talked about different names all the way home. But we kept calling it farms from that minute. And, Madison Avenue is right. It doesn't matter what your name is as long as people spell it right and remember it. And that's how farms got its name.
And there was a meeting held in 1980 in the home of this man, Delbert Palmer in Provo, and that was the first time that John and Jack and I met each other in person. And it was shortly thereafter that Jack accepted the invitation to go be on the faculty of the BOA Law School, and then Farms moved to Provo. We had the centennial edition of the Book of Mormon come out in 1980 from Deseret Book. And we had Elder Bruce Armour Conkey, who supervised the 1981 translate or edition of the scriptures that we still use today. But this was the Farms logo, and we began operation in 1981 after Jack moved up to Provo. And one of the first things we did was put together a little slideshow called The Lions of the Book of Mormon.
Great.
I wrote the script, John Sorensen edited the script, and in there it said, the River Sidon is probably the Grijalva River, or it may be the Usumacinta River. And that was essentially where we stood in 1981. And that way we sold thousands of those things around the church, because it was really rather graphic, a depiction of what Mesoamerica was like.
A lot of pictures. It was state of the art at the time.
We had a newsletter called The Insights, and we, in 1984, began publishing updates. 1984.
And those updates were monthly executive reports on some new discovery that had been made, and we eventually collected all of those updates. We're not going to get through all of this, Kirk. I thought we were finished.
Well, they're the updates, right? I just want to get the updates there, Jack.
Good. And yes, they are published in these books, and they're on the Maxwell Institute website. But that was one of the dynamic things that we did. Every month, we mailed out just a one-page letter. Bob Smith will remember how hard it was to squeeze all of that, because my rule was one page. Had to be on one side of one piece of paper. Why? Because it cost more money to copy on both sides. We didn't have any money, so.
Bob Smith did the very first critical text.
Yep.
In there.
1984.
84, second edition, 87. And of course, that's laid the foundation of what we have today with World Scouts. And well, we're out of time. Brothers and sisters, the Book of Mormon is true. I bear my testimony from an academic perspective, from a textual perspective, and from a spiritual perspective. This book is true.
And Kirk, what a wonderful privilege it's been. Kirk and I have worked together now for, what is it now, 32 years, huh? And things are just beginning to roll. I'd also testify that, the reason that Farms was a great success was because there were needs. We did not create those needs, but we found ways to meet those needs. And those needs still exist today. Those needs are, we need to be able to coordinate research, to talk with each other, to mobilize teams of people, to be able to accomplish the breadth of things that need to be said and researched and done. This Book of Mormon is amazingly complicated and at the same time profoundly simple. It's a miracle that it can be both. To be able to plumb the depths of this book, we need to be better organized, and we need people from all sides working on it. That was the Farms model. Bring everyone in with competence. Enthusiasm alone isn't enough. Need number 2 was we needed to be able to get things out inexpensively to all the world. And what Kirk is doing now with the web, what we were doing with our little single-page pieces of paper copying and sending out 200 copies each month wasn't a drop in the bucket. But today what we can do is still the Farms model of inexpensively getting all of this material out in accessible, findable, organized ways. Right now the web is chaotic. People can't find what they're looking for because the Google search engines won't give them the answers to the questions that they want. We need to do a better job of organizing all that's been done so that people can find and effectively get what they want. Farms was doing that, and that need will continue and is going on. Farms maybe doesn't exist in the way that it used to, but all of these functions are still going on. And if you're interested in promoting or supporting any of those functions, just find the people who are doing it. I don't believe in raising money, and that was the third thing we needed to do, was get some money to be able to make things like this happen. But I don't believe in raising money for overhead or for an endowment. The money that we raised was project money. We raised money because we had a project that we wanted to get done, and that money was put to work immediately, and that gave results. And that was one of the key successes of Farms, and that's still going on. There are projects all over that need help. A fourth need was quality control. How do we make sense of all of these things that are being tossed out? Who will judge? Well, judging academically is always very difficult. Peer reviewing is dicey at best, but it takes strenuous activity by knowledgeable, good-willed people to be able to see that what we are putting out to the world is the best that it possibly can be. Farms and other people have been very good at seeing that we had the kind of quality control that we need. And finally, the fifth thing that I've already touched on a minute ago is that ultimately the need that the church and the world has is for the spiritual value of the Book of Mormon. The reason that we do this is not, as Elder Maxwell once said to me, not just for the gee whiz value. There are a lot of gee whiz, wow, how did that get into the Book of Mormon kind of thing. But until those points are translated into spiritual lessons that can influence the lives of people, not just in the church, but throughout the world, the Book of Mormon is a witness to the whole world. And until we have done that, we haven't got our job done. So brothers and sisters, I testify that the Book of Mormon is true, and that what the world needs now is the Book of Mormon in so many ways. I pray that we can be instruments in making that happen. Don't say, whoa, it's all over, or farms is not the way it used to be. The Lord knows what He's doing. Change is a part of where we go to be able to respond to new needs as they come up. The Lord is in the heavens, and He's in charge of what's happening. We just need to be inspired, be diligent, do what we can to make that go forward. And I testify that this is true, and that, Kirk, what a wonderful survey of the history of all of this. This hasn't come out of nowhere, and it's not going to nowhere either. I testify in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.